Good morning to you here in person. Good morning to you joining us over Zoom. Welcome to the first day of our 2022 Payton Lectures. And before I get going, I'll introduce myself. My name is David Taylor. I am an associate professor of theology and culture here at Fuller Seminary. And I would now like to introduce Fuller Seminary's Clifford Penner Presidential Chair, Mark Laberton, to give a brief greeting that was pre-recorded, so you'll see this on the screen behind me.
Welcome to the 2022 Payton Lectures at Fuller Theological Seminary. We're so glad that you're here and looking forward to all that you are going to experience, the provocation of these thoughts, whether you're physically present or online. We're very glad to welcome you to this great opportunity year by year to gather, and this year to be considering the theme, Embodied Theological Education in a Disembodied Age. At Fuller, we have been engaged in the intersection between both residential or in-person education and online education for more than 2 decades. This is not a new conversation to us, but this is an opportunity for us to do both some self-reflection as an institution, but also as an institution that's part of a larger ecology of educational opportunities that are forming people in so many different ways around the world, with increasingly important resources being digital rather than face-to-face education and formation. That dynamic sets up all kinds of questions, which these lectures are going to present an opportunity for us to consider, to debate, to weigh, to evaluate. And we look forward to all of the interaction that's going to follow as these lectures unfold. It's my great privilege to welcome you here and to say that I hope these lectures help us as Fuller to continue to grow in our understanding of what we want to say about embodied theological education in a disembodied age, but also to influence you in whatever roles of leadership or influence you may have as these conversations about our humanity, our understanding of living an incarnational faith, and doing so in a distributed, digital, online form. All of these dynamics are the richness that these days will unfold, and we thank you for being part of it.
Thank you, Dr. Laberton. Really appreciate that, wherever you may find yourself on planet Earth. Before I give a few more housekeeping remarks, allow me to offer a few opening framing remarks about our conference here in the next couple of days. In an essay written 20 years ago, which this side of COVID-19 is more like 200 years ago, Greg Jones, who is the former dean of Duke Divinity School and the current president of Belmont University, offers this observation about the tensions that academics often face in their vocation. Quote, "Throughout the season of our lives, we as Christians, we as Christian academics, are called to negotiate our sense of vocation by continually narrating and re-narrating the dramas of our lives in relation to God. These are dramas with numerous twists and turns and calls for discernment. These dramas will often involve difficult and sometimes tragic choices. Whether they entail tragedy in the strong sense is significantly dependent on the health and well-being of the communities and institutions to which we have devoted our critical allegiance." End quote. Jones, I think, describes the drama of our current predicament rather well. None of us, that is, could have predicted in early 2020 that our world would have to shut down on account of the coronavirus and that we as teachers would be forced to teach all of our classes over Zoom. And few of us as faculty at Fuller Theological Seminary could have anticipated a future where our largest campus is not, in fact, Pasadena, but online. We sit, as we often do these days, at our computers recording videos into a miniature camera, hoping that our students on the other side of this digital divide will connect in some fashion to what we have said. We facilitate discussions over Zoom that require us to scroll back and forth between tiny screens that arrange our students' faces into even tinier squares. We dress up or dress down for the occasion, depending on the mood of the day. And we address difficult topics like race and gender and language that we use for God without being able to read the room or to get a feel for people's real-time, in-the-flesh responses. The purpose of this conference, then, is to attempt to make sense of this drama of our own brave new digital age. We're asking questions that need to be asked about theological education, but whose answers are neither self-evident nor ready to wear, as they say in the fashion world. For instance, while the embodied experience of a residential classroom may seem like a self-evidential good, many of our presenters today and tomorrow will contest this assumption and argue that so-called traditional pedagogical practices hardly constitute a richly embodied experience. Teaching online, conversely, may seem to some like the abomination that causes desolation for physical bodies. But again, as our presenters will remind us over the next 2 days, this assumption betrays an ignorance about the rich possibilities for embodied learning in so-called virtual spaces. A third thing that our presenters will contest is the idea that embodiment is just a noun. At best, that is, a complex and complicated idea. They'll also propose that embodiment is a verb, which is to say that it does things. It makes certain worlds possible, certain worlds impossible, certain worlds decidedly unimaginable and therefore undesirable, and that this, in very specific ways, is deeply problematic. One thing I can guarantee you, our discussion will be far from boring or homogeneous, and I hope each of you here and online will stay tuned and press in with your own questions about the topic at hand. A final thing to mention in these opening remarks is that we have chosen to treat this year's Payton Lectures as a kind of laboratory experiment. On this account, you will see no presentations take place from a lectern. You'll only see, hopefully, vigorous, charitable conversation amongst colleagues. You'll hear no polished papers, but only works or thoughts in progress. And you'll experience not one person, but 9 people wrestling with a topic that resist facile interpretation. And the final hope of it all, I hope, for myself, as well as for you, not just today and tomorrow, but with the eventual book that will come from this gathering, is wisdom. Wisdom for us as scholars and as administrators as we navigate a strange and perhaps unpredictable future for theological education. With that said, allow me to make a few housekeeping remarks. 1, please help yourself, if you're here present in Pasadena, to the coffee and pastries that are out there in the breezeway. Restrooms are located outside. For those of you here, restrooms are located in your home or office if you're online. If you're posting on social media, use the hashtag Fuller 2022 Payton Lectures to share any experiences or quotables if you wish. And we encourage you to continue inviting anyone who may be interested in these topics, as people are still able to register virtually for the entire event. Now, all of our program presenters will remain on stage throughout the entire duration of the discussion and conversation. Each session will begin with a chance for each individual presenter to offer a 5-minute summary or any other additional comments that they wish to make about their presentation, and then we'll have 40 minutes for fellow presenters to engage them in conversation. Now, while the papers cannot be shared publicly in their entirety for copyright reasons, we invite you to reference the abstracts for these papers that have been sent to you via Eventbrite email. I don't know what the case is for those of you who are in the room. Do you guys have access to that? You do? Thank the Lord. We encourage you also to text your questions for our presenters. Is that phone number up there behind us? The number is 626-655-1775. It's up there somewhere, said the mouse. And I'll get those questions, and then I will share them with our presenters. Now, we're not going to spend any amount of time presenting our presenters in detail. If you wish to know more about them, you can simply go to the website for this event, fuller.edu/Payton Lectures. With all of those housekeeping matters said, I would like to invite all of our wonderful presenters up to the stage and invite our first presenter, Robert Chow Romero, to offer his initial responses or comments, additional notes to his presentation titled A Pedagogy of Cultural Belonging and Praxis. And Robert, you can say whatever you wish about your circumstances at the moment. I don't know, am I looking at you or am I looking at you? I have my back to you.
Sorry to come to you this morning at a conference about embodiment in a disembodied fashion, but I was struck by the COVID bug a couple of days ago. Wasn't sure if I was going to make it, but feeling a lot better. So here I am. So it's such a privilege to join you today. I'm in my full-time capacity, I'm a professor at UCLA, but I spend a lot of time at Fuller. I'm kind of like the cousin that hangs around the house like for weeks at a time, even though there's not really part of the immediate family. And so it's a privilege to join you today. My brief paper is entitled A Pedagogy of Cultural Belonging and Praxis. And my problem statement, just to kind of just start off quick out of the gate, my problem statement is that disembodied theological education leads to lack of cultural belonging and fragmentation of the body of Christ. Disembodied theological education leads to lack of cultural belonging and fragmentation of the body of Christ. Such disembodied theological education often takes the form of, at least in the United States, one dominant racial and cultural group claiming to offer a seminary education which is simply objective, when in reality, its curriculum excludes most other God-given cultural perspectives. Passages like Revelation 7:9 or Revelation 21:26 are given often superficial acknowledgement, but when professors or students of color try to offer differing perspectives, they are often dismissed. In the end, this approach is not really disembodied because consciously or subconsciously, it does have one group of bodies in mind as the source of biblical knowledge and pastoral understanding. As a solution, I want to propose a pedagogy of belonging and praxis. And the solution that I want to propose comes from my last 17 years as a professor at UCLA of Chicano studies and Asian American studies and ethnic studies. As an approach to fostering a sense of belonging among Latino young adults, what if US seminaries offered a wide breadth of courses which were grounded in the community cultural wealth of the living, breathing, diverse Latino community of the US and Latin America? And as a second distinct pedagogical approach, what if we offered more courses centered upon social justice praxis and the Latino community? This matters desperately because the US church and theological education in the US in general, as you all know, is at the end of its rope. It's at the end of its rope. The numbers don't lie. Right? The numbers of those attending seminary is plummeting. The numbers of the majority culture US church are plummeting. And in contradistinction, the numbers of the global church and the immigrant church are where the vast vibrancy of the church lies, both globally and locally. It is my contention, my further contention, that the vibrant faith and God-given cultural perspectives of the global body of Christ and the immigrant church hold the keys to the healing of the US church, and that they are the future. Moving on now, I'd like to just offer a few insights from ethnic studies my formal discipline of training. From the perspective of ethnic studies, the topic of embodiment and disembodiment has more to do with the deeper issues of cultural belonging and identity than formal modes of instruction, whether this is digital or otherwise. Chicano studies and Asian American studies, my two disciplines, arose as academic movements precisely because the bodily suffering and cultural identities of Latino and Asian American communities were ignored as valid subject matters of academic inquiry by the academy. At the most basic level, ethnic studies promotes cultural belonging by offering interdisciplinary courses of contemporary relevance to the cultural communities they represent, taught by role models from these same communities. A second way in which ethnic studies achieves a sense of belonging among its students is by emphasizing the community cultural wealth of these ethnic communities, or what John refers to in Revelation 21:26 as the glory and honor of the nations. It also achieves a sense of belonging by setting aside cultural deficit models of thinking and by intentionally bridging research, curriculum, and community. As an approach to fostering a sense of belonging among Latino young adults, what if U.S. seminaries offered a wide breadth of courses which were grounded in the community cultural wealth of the living, breathing, diverse Latino community of the U.S. and Latin America? As a second distinctive pedagogical approach, what if we offered more courses centered upon social justice praxis and the Latino community? In sum, what if we explored a pedagogy of cultural belonging and praxis? I'd like to close with a reflection from Justo Gonzalez briefly. Justo Gonzalez, the pioneer Latino theologian of the US, says that John's vision of the beloved community in the book of Revelation, his vision of the beloved community from every nation, tribe, people, and language, is the future to which we are called in the present. In the words of Gonzalez, this is the vision out of which the church must live. The church lives not only out of its past, but also out of its future, not only out of its efficient cause, but also out of its final cause. May we live, may we reform, may we renew seminary education in such a way that we are called from this future hope. Thank you very much.
Robert, I'm looking at you this way. Oh, I gotta get my microphone. I'm gonna look at you this way, right? So you can look at me, I'm looking at you in the face. You're seeing my face, is that right?
Actually, I'm not seeing you right now. I think your camera might be off.
Oh, it's okay. I just feel my soul. That's all that matters right now. That's a joke. Okay, let me start off by asking you a question, and then we'll hand it off to Wilmer for the second question. One of your contentions in your paper is that theological education historically has served to form what you call the white self-sufficient man. I'm wondering if you have an example, either personal or otherwise, of what this looks like. So I'm wondering if you can show us, in addition to the telling of this idea, do you have an example of what this looks like, an experience in theological education or otherwise, that is forming, and what does that look like to form a self-sufficient white man?
Okay, you're not messing around from the start, huh? So
it's your paper.
In the Latin, okay, let me use the example of Moses, right? So Moses, he grew up, with all the luxuries, right, of Pharaoh's court, and at a certain point in time, he said, "No, I got to side with my people, right? And I got to, devote my life not just for my personal self-interest, but for my larger community." Now, it took a number of years for that to get worked out. But in the Latino community, it kind of works out in a similar way. Many of us, we might grow up in Goshen, and then we attend seminary at like a predominantly white institution. We get some accolades, right? And we can forget that we have a whole community behind us. We can forget that we're here because of our mothers and our fathers and our grandmothers, right? And it's tempting to fit into this mold of a white sufficient man and to say, well, to be honest, to bust a Ted Cruz and say, oh, I'm here because I pulled myself up by my own bootstraps, right? Oh, look at all of you Latinos. You just got to get with the picture, and I'm going to have my big mega church, and everybody else, too bad. That's an example of fitting into that mold of a white, self-sufficient man.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you. Wilmer,
Yes.
over to you, good sir.
Robert, for your presentation. I'm curious to know, you mentioned Justo Gonzalez's idea of community, beloved community. And would you envision in your paper to use that concept, that theme of beloved community, to make a connection or a proposal for a cultural belonging, especially as you engage students that are minoritized sometimes in online courses? How would you envision that in your paper as far as what Gonzalez is proposing in your argument for cultural belonging, and how we can make that happen as a result of your paper? Any thoughts on that?
Absolutely. And so I want to say first that because when we don't offer students the opportunity to bring their community, God-given community cultural wealth and perspectives into the classroom, then we force them to go to other places. And that's what's happening. Like so many students that I work with now, right? They're burned out with the church. And so they go to activist circles to find that sense of cultural belonging. But in those activist circles, first of all, Jesus is not centered. Second of all, they're told that Christianity is incompatible with issues of justice. And thirdly, they're many times not given a vision of the beloved community. So they gain a sense of personal ethnic sort of pride, which is good, but then they become kind of more narrowly focused, and there's not a vision of the beloved community, right? I think that's what we as followers of Christ, it's a game changer that we have to offer, that Jesus wants us to move towards this beloved community where people of every ethnic group, cultural background, possess this distinct community cultural wealth that John describes in Revelation 21:26. And so I think to bring it out in the classroom means to be able to give students a chance to offer their distinct perspectives from their God-given local Latino church, right, of 50 people, to bring that into the classroom, to allow them to be able to see that, no, that's a valid perspective too, that the perspective of their abuelita and her faith is a valid perspective. It's not just what some kind of whatever some old guys thought about in Switzerland in the 1700s in a castle or something. Like, that's okay, but to be able to validate those perspectives and to bring them into active, meaningful conversation, I think that would be a validation of this larger concept of beloved community.
And I now open it up to any of our fellow presenters. Don't be shy. Who would like to ask or offer another comment or question?
Okay,
Erin.
I'll go for it. Hi, Robert. It's Erin. So I, was one of a couple Euro-Americans sitting up here. What would you say either to someone like me teaching? Obviously, I'm not Latina in any way or shape or form, other than taking over California. What do you advise for me as I teach students? How can I foster that kind of culture of belonging when I'm not from that particular group? And so that's one question, you can answer that. Or what benefit is there for my students who are not Latin or Central American for this kind of pedagogy?
So the benefit is that the goal is the beloved community, right? Right? Revelation 21, Revelation 7, that's the goal. And we're not going to get there until all the cultural treasure and wealth of the body of Christ is somehow integrated. It's a complicated process, right? Integrated into the curriculum, into leadership, into role models of professors and administrators, right? We're not going to get to Revelation 21 unless we live into Revelation 21. And so I'm not just saying like, okay, we should just, just teach Latino perspectives and that's all, but rather that the breadth of the body of Christ, of that cultural treasure and wisdom needs to be integrated into curriculum, right? As an example, it's for the benefit of us all. And so the Brown Church, for example, is not about the Brown Church as an end goal. It's just a different entry point into the beloved community. And whatever we've been doing for a while, it has not led us to the beloved community. Sadly, I wish it was not so.
So, good morning, Robert. Do I look over there to see you, or do I look over? How does it work? That way. Okay. So glad you're with us. I was thinking about cultural hybridization. I was thinking about Daniel Orlando Alvarez's work about the Holy Spirit and cultural hybridization. And I'm just curious about how we make space, in your perspective, both for each person's culture of belonging, but also for this process of cultural hybridization that happens even in a classroom. Like, how is that different from assimilation?
Mm-hmm. Sure. So we face this dilemma like at UCLA also. And so, for example, in most of our classes in ethnic studies, they're based upon 1960s ethnic cultural categories, right? Which is an improvement. But now the quickest growing ethnic population in the US is mixed race, right? By far, right? And it just shows me that, this process of cultural formation, and it's constant, it's ongoing from one man, one person. God made all nations of human beings, right? And that, I just did was reviewing my my genetic tests, the kind of 23andMe thing. It was fascinating just to really see that played out, like from one ancestor, as Paul talks about and science teaches, we're all here through a never-ending process of cultural hybridization. And so I think that it's a balance in the classroom, I would say, of kind of bringing in, those perspectives that are forgotten, and also bringing in those perspectives as they are in development and progression.
Thanks, Robert. Anybody else?
Thank you, Robert, for your paper, your presentation, who you bring, who you are. What you're talking about makes me think about the dynamic process of centering and decentering that seems like you're talking about. So, you suggest more courses centered on social justice practice in the Latino community. And you also talk about how the vibrancy of the church really lies in the immigrant and the global churches. And so I think maybe a way you're helping me conceive of kind of that dynamic in the classroom is that as students, you talk about also how students of color experience that ecological transition, which I actually want to ask you more about. But there is this pain. There is a break in thought, a break in transitions are hard. And a lot of the time, the onus of that transition, the ecological transition, the cultural transition, is on people of color, minoritized, underrepresented students, because they may not be well versed in the unspoken rules of the academy. And so I think sometimes, I think when we talk about decentering whiteness, there is this other movement of centering Latino, for example, cultural wealth and Latino communities and voices, for example, and that it's not, in doing so, it's not superimposing that culture or those people over and against others, but it's kind of going back to that idea of Revelation 21 and that all treasure and wealth of the body of Christ, it will require a decentering. And it does require a sustained centering that's not just one day long, one book long, but a kind of a centering that creates an ecological transition for students who don't normally feel it. And in that, experiencing how their lack and hence the wealth that they need from one another, from others. And so at least for me, that's what your paper and your thoughts are helping me form when I think about the classroom and that movement, that dynamic. So thank you
so much. That helps me. Like I'm thinking about that term ecological transition, which I didn't have a chance to bring in this shorter paper. But for folks who might be wondering, sometimes it's tough for us as Latino Latino students, like we go to like UCLA and we're like, oh my gosh, I've never seen so many white people before. What do I do, right? Like, it's like a shock, right? And you have to sort of figure out like all, just how to orient yourself, the modes of learning and social interactions. And what do you do when someone in your dorm room says, oh, would you like to go on my yacht this weekend? Right. And that leads to another part of my paper where traditionally white educators would say, in order to allow students of color to succeed in higher education, basically we need them to assimilate because their cultures of origin are deficient. Their cultures of origins are deficient, right? Latino students don't succeed in seminary because basically they're not like this self-sufficient white guy from wherever, right? And so in order to succeed, these students need to become middle-class white guys, right? I'm gonna say a bad word. In critical race theory, Tara Yoso, my colleague, she talked about how that's a wrong approach. That's a wrong approach. A cultural deficit approach is wrong. But instead, she says that students of color bring distinct community cultural wealth that is different from majority culture, but it's just as valuable. And she articulates this community cultural wealth in terms of like distinct linguistic abilities and family networks and social capital and spiritual resources. In my work, I said, let's find a biblical parallel to that, to her framework of community cultural wealth. And that's where I draw from Revelation 21, verse 26, right? And the idea of the glory and honor of the nations. But I think that highlighting the glory and honor of all the nations, it's not to put down other people. It's just to say that, hey, we're God's children too. We're one of the tribes and the nations. Revelation 7, right? Every people of every language, nation, tribe, and tongue. We're one of them too. We don't have to become another tribe in order to be accepted by God. And that's all that we're saying. We're God's children too. But we're used to just being squeezed out of the family picture. And that's the problem.
Yeah, thanks so much, Robert, for your paper. I'm really intrigued by that term, community cultural wealth. And I'm curious if you could elaborate on how online teaching might provide some unique opportunities and challenges for exploring the unique community cultural wealth of the Latino community.
Sure. I think maybe speak about the unique opportunities first. Cool thing that I'm experimenting with, and I'm sure all of us here, is like there's so much available online, right? Like YouTube videos and TikTok, and I don't even know all the stuff, right? Where that community cultural wealth is expressed online in a very organic way. So I think of like the group Las Cafeteras. Las Cafeteras is it's like a Mexican-American, East LA Latinx kind of like folk rock group that really expresses the glory and honor of what it means to be from East LA, right? Actually, one of the founding members is one of my doctoral students at UCLA, which is pretty cool. But if you just play their YouTube video of La Bamba Rebelde, you don't even have to say anything, and you feel the glory and honor of that, right? And you're like, oh, right. And so I think that the multimedia world we live in, that's exciting because we have all these different opportunities to be able to show it, right? It's not just a book anymore. Challenges of that, I think, comes in terms of the deep personal interaction. Like, if I remember a few weeks ago, we had these conversations about these different race topics in one of my classes. And after the class, I had my office hours, but we just sat underneath a tree and we had this very organic conversations, about 5 of us, for an hour, all about these topics. It was so beautiful, right? And I think, of course, the online setting, it doesn't offer that, right? So I think those would be some of the kind of the exciting potential, but then also some of the limitations.
Yeah. Robert, I'm a fan. I'm a total fan. I read The Brown Church about 2 years ago, and I've given it to friends to read, and I am such a fan. And as you're talking about the benefits of YouTube videos and kind of the cultural wealth there, I'm also aware of, as a psychologist, so I'm coming to this conversation not as a theologian, but as a psychologist, and I'm also aware of the pain that's involved in doing this work and the importance of having safe spaces, having classes where there is an acknowledgement of the cultural wealth in order to also be able to hold the pain together. And I would say, as a white person, there's a lot of pain in the self-sufficient white male too. And so figuring, like, there's so much that these classes you're describing can give to all of the communities. They're part of moving towards the beloved community. And I just would love to hear you reflect on what would you see as important pieces of the cultural wealth, the cultural community wealth, that you'd want to highlight, that you'd want to dig in theologically, that you'd want all of us to understand and join.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. I think just to kind of address some of what you first said, and then to go to that second part of your question, I think that we need classes and spaces of all types. Right? We need classes where students of color can be safe to just vent and to lament, right? To use Tung Chan's book, lament openly in safety, like that. You need classes like that. And then you need classes probably where people can kind of work through the beloved community dimensions. Because sometimes it's too painful, right? Sometimes I just want to be able to just vent. And so I think we need all different types of spaces and courses and student groups and big groups, small groups. So I think that's one thing. Formal settings, informal settings. In terms of the community cultural wealth, let me just give a couple of examples, because from Latino theology, from Brown theology, if you will. So right now, people are deconstructing and reconstructing, and lots of deconstructing is happening, and sometimes not too much reconstructing, right? Going in all these different directions, and it's quite painful. I should say, as someone who came to know Jesus as an adult in law school, my primary gift is evangelism, and nothing breaks my heart more than when I see people fall away from faith because they think that it's a dichotomy of, okay, I'm going to care about justice and race, or I'm just going to, or I'm going to follow Jesus. Like, they feel like the two aren't compatible. And I'm devastated. I have many sleepless nights about that, meeting students like that. But if we look to the experience, for example, in the history of the Brown Church and Brown theology, here's an example that can help in a very practical way. So Latin America, and Alexia is an expert on this, and Sung Chan and others, Wilmer and so many others. But in Latin America, about 50 years ago, you had what we call InterVarsity that was sort of getting planted and being developed there. And the late Rene Padilla and Samuel Escobar, they were trained in the United States through InterVarsity, and they got some good training about the individual dimensions of the gospel, right? Personal relationship with Jesus and grace and so forth, right? Which is so important. But then they went to those university campuses in Latin America in a time of great revolutionary foment, kind of like the US today. And they said, believe the good news. Jesus loves you and wants to have a personal relationship with you. And the students turned to him. Of course, this is my paraphrasing. And they said, why is this good news? My dad just got killed by the US-backed military government yesterday. My uncle got desaparecido. Nobody on my block has food to eat. Why is this good news? And Padilla and Escobar and others, they sat back and they said, we need to take this seriously, right? And they gathered a group of different ministers and theologians and so forth. And they gathered in community and developed this theology of misión integral, integral mission. And they said, like, the gospel is like a plane with two wings. One wing is the verbal proclamation, Jesus Christ is Lord and Savior and King. He died on the cross and rose again to make us and the whole world new. Nothing and no one is left out. Right? But secondly, I'm literally, I know, preaching to the preachers, right? but secondly, if we have experienced that transformation in Christ, then we have to embody that, right? In justice and loving our neighbor, right? Second, to state it another way, Jesus wants to transform every aspect of who we are as individuals, right? But Jesus also, through God's kingdom, desires to transform every aspect of this broken and fallen world, right? That is destroyed and that is less than what God wants because of sin, right? To use Kuyper, right? There's no square inch of all creation for which Christ does not cry out, "This is mine," right? Now, most U.S. churches, we're having this debate about deconstruction and reconstruction, deconstruction and reconstruction. And in Latin America, we went through that 50 years ago, right? And so in the U.S., most of our churches, most of our seminaries are emphasizing one wing or another, and the plane is crashing. Right? The plane of U.S. seminaries and U.S. churches are crashing when we could look to the community cultural wealth, right? Through those theological insights and the lived historical experience of the Brown Church. And I can cite 1,000 more, right? From the Latin American church, from the Chinese church, from the Korean church, from the African church, and all of its diversity. There's so many things. It's just untapped. It's like the U.S. church has like this mansion with like 50 rooms of it filled with treasure, but they're still stuck in one bedroom.
I'm supposed to follow that up? I mean, that's not fair, Robert. You're quoting Kuyper and critical race theory and Padilla, and I can't follow that up. So thank you for your really, really wonderful words. I'm going to be less eloquent and talk about food if I can, and kind of would love your response on this. One of the illustrations that I've been using about churches when it comes to kind of diversity, and I want to tie this in with your work, is that in the U.S. there's been the historical image of the melting pot, right? And that's the way our churches have operated. We bring all these races, cultures to seminary, and then we melt away their cultures. We put them in boiling hot water, and their ethnic identity, racial identity is supposed to be, cream of mushroom soup at the end of the process. So what we've ended up with is a fairly destructive, in contrast to what you're proposing, a fairly destructive mode of education, make everybody kind of one bland flavor. And then the second mode that we've used in the US is the salad bowl. And there you get all these different vegetables, but as I've often said, you get the biggest vat of creamy ranch and cover everybody with creamy ranch. So jalapeno tastes like creamy ranch, kimchi tastes like creamy ranch, everything starts tasting like creamy ranch. And so we may look different, but we all taste the same. Our flavor is the same. And so that's been our kind of mode. And I think that's also, both of those images are kind of what you're coming up against to say, this is what education as a whole, but seminary education maybe in particular, particularly in the US and in the West, that's what we've done. We've melted away culture, or we've covered it up. So my third image is of an all-you-can-eat buffet, right? How do we create a feast? And I'm not talking about Sizzler. I'm talking about Vegas, where the sushi is actually made by someone who's Japanese. The Chinese food is actually made by a chef from China. The Italian food is even made by someone from Italy. So those kinds of images of can we bring, and that's the resonance that I'm having with your talk here, of that's what we bring. We bring our full selves to the table. We're not watered down. We're not melted away. We're not covered up. And that is like a very hopeful vision of what theological education can be. And kind of responding to what Aaron said earlier as well, I also feel like that's the positive contribution from the white community, right? There's kind of an apologizing for whiteness, which I understand because of the history. But sometimes it's helpful to say, I'm white, but I also bring my Scottish heritage to the mix, right? And there's a story here that I want to contribute, not as the main and only sole course or the salad dressing.
I want Scottish food.
Okay, yeah, no, I've had haggis, I'm with you. But that's where the place of, can we bring not our disembodied selves to the table, but our fully embodied selves, and that includes the embracing of our identity as the fully formed, our fully formed human cultural identity.
Amen. Amen. No, I totally agree with all those metaphors. And usually what happens is, we try to bring our full self and they say, sorry, that's a little bit too spicy. We don't really want Mexican food. We want, we want Taco Bell, right? That's kind of what happens a lot. But in terms of like our white brothers and sisters, yeah, like I know that, like, I'm not saying like do away with all of seminary education. because it's all bad, but like, retain the glory and the honor of it. There's glory and honor, right? That's why our families are here. That's why we're here, right? Because there is lots of glory and honor, but that the way that race developed in the U.S., right? The term, unfortunately, the term white was not a neutral ethnic descriptor, right? Someone might say, "Oh yeah, I'm Swedish. Yeah, I live in Chicago, and I'm Swedish on my mom's side, and I'm Dutch on my dad's side." Like that's like a neutral descriptor. But something, and I know all my colleagues know this, but like for those who might be listening, when the term white was first developed, it was a legal term, right? That only a few people, a certain number of people fit into that category. And if you fit into that legal category, then you could live where you wanted. You could go to seminary where you wanted. You could get whatever job you wanted. You could send your kids to whatever school, right? And if you didn't fit into that legal category, well, you just couldn't, right? You experienced, all the negative things of segregation. And so it becomes complicated then, because when you try to break that system, that legal system down, that social system down, we're not saying that people who at one time were called white, or even now, is bad to have their specific cultural backgrounds. That's not what we're saying, right? We're saying that this legal social system that was called white, right? That system, like it was flawed from the start. And in terms of what it means to reclaim the glory and honor of Euro-American culture, and there's a lot of that glory and honor, just like everybody else, right? We just need to come up with new terms. And I don't know that's not my job. I don't know how to do that for everybody, but, and then I'll just say this also. Revelation 21:26 says that the glory and honor of the nations, the cultural treasure and wealth of the nations will be brought in, like for eternity. But verse 27 says that nothing that causes sin will be brought in. So all of our ethnic cultural heritages have glory and honor and sin, whether it's Swedish or Mexican or Chinese, or we're all on the equal playing field. But unfortunately, education has been structured historically to say, well, all the glory and honor belongs to one group of people, and most of the sin belongs to these other people, right? So what does it mean to kind of just restructure, realign, to readjust the buffet line, right? So we can see things more clearly.
Robert, let me ask you just one last question before we transition to Aaron's presentation. And it's a question that I think I'm going to want to ask everybody on this panel. I love what you're saying. I love what every one of us is, or you guys are saying. But it raises a little bit of a tension for me, because what I hear is suggestions that are related to curricular and pedagogical issues. That is, if we could change our syllabi to have different reading lists, we would have a better educational experience. If we had different modes of learning in our classroom settings, we would have, a more rich learning experience. But I think at some point we have to ask ourselves about the institutional and organizational inertias or structures themselves that fight against the possibility of learning in different modes more fully or richly. So I think about your experience with your students sitting under that tree, have this extraordinary moment of learning together that your students will probably remember for the rest of their life. And I wonder to myself, but what if there were an institution that were structured differently, structured not to produce by default the white self-sufficient man, but structured to produce, to propagate, to encourage, to give space for more sitting under the tree, right? And that a student were assessed in different, modes, rather than grades and papers and exams and quizzes and, things like that. So here's my question to you. Do you think about that? Because it sounds like an important task, but it also sounds like an exhausting task. Nobody has the wherewithal to change an entire institution. But UCLA has accrediting bodies, that says you got to do certain things. So have you thought about the possibility of what it would look like for there to be institutional and organizational new wineskins, to use that language?
Yeah, so that's something that, my department was founded out of a hunger strike, precisely because all the structures and systems were so messed up. And so, gosh, and then what does it look, translate that into, what does it look like now in 2022? Oh my gosh. I mean, just talk to my students in Chicano studies. You'll find that, boy, there's so much institutional structural work that needs to happen. And administrators will say the same thing, and it's exhausting. And boy, that's why we have lots of people at UCLA, for example, thinking about that, committees and blah, blah, blah. And it is really exhausting. Secondly, in terms of what I heard you kind of hint at is like the different modes of evaluation, right? Maybe that goes more into Wilmer's talk, to foster this more kind of creative thinking and learning process. And good thing I just took the Fuller Learning to Teach online class, because I'm going to be teaching in Brown Church in the summer. And it's amazing. Like there's a wealth of resources there about, different types of assessment and learning and the way students learn. So I guess that's more of a technical kind of question. But yeah, lots of work to be done, and it can be very daunting, but it's worth it. Let's go for it.
Well, thank you, Robert. A warm, heartfelt thanks for starting us off in our conference.
Thank you. I feel so honored. So honored. Thank you.
Well, we're grateful. So Robert Chao Romero is the Associate Professor of Chicano-Chicana Studies and Asian American Studies at UCLA. And you live nearby, don't you, Robert? Somewhere right around the corner from Aaron, is that right?
Yeah, I live, yes, right. Really close, so.
That's wonderful. So thanks for being with us under the circumstances. And at this point, we wish to pivot. So we'll have one more session, and then we'll take a little bit of a break. So Aaron Dufault Hunter is Associate Professor of Christian Ethics here at Fuller Seminary. And Aaron, at this point, we invite you to offer your 5-minute remarks, and then we will open it up again. And then if you all here in the room or online have any questions, feel free to text it to that number, and I will collect them on this iPad. So Aaron, over to you.
Okay, so I'm going to begin by naming what I think is why we should care about theological education at all. Even if you are, like a lot of students are not going to go into theological education, right? So why care? And I'm going to quote Paul here and say, he makes a comment in Romans where he says, "Don't be conformed to the patterns of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your minds so that you might know what's acceptable, perfect, mature." And my argument is that what makes theological education indispensable is that its job is to give us the lenses, like a prism that takes the light, you might say, of the world we swim in, the society that we're in, and it can fracture that light and help us see what it's made up of. And it can see the patterns, it exposes the patterns of conformity, of ways that our society, as social animals, this is the great part of social science, right? Social scientists can display for us and show us, absolutely, we both create culture and society, some of the goods that Robert just talked about, right? But some of that actually is conforming us to patterns of evil from Paul's perspective. And theology that's indispensable does these two things. It helps us see those conforming patterns and offers us or coaches us in how to resist them in a kind of counter formation that's always necessary for transformation. Now, the problem with theology, in part, is that it has become disembodied. It's forgotten Paul's understanding that when he says, "For the renewing of your minds," he's talking about that in the context of offering our bodies as a living sacrifice. And Paul's not talking only about metaphor there. He literally means your body. He's a good Jew, right? Jews know that part of fidelity to God has to do with, as Charles Primus, I think at Duke once said, The only God who's interesting has something to say about pots and pans and genitals, right? Like in Leviticus, it's all in, right? The God of Paul, the God of Israel wants all of us, a la John Lennon, legend, right? Right? All of God wants all of us. And the problem with theology and why it has been accused of being uninteresting and irrelevant is that it has forgotten that one of our great theologians, someone like Paul, never fragmented the mind from the body, from the heart, and never fractured that from the ordinary habits of our life, like who we live with, how we live in the spaces we live, how we spend our money, what we consume and how we consume it, or indeed, how we even engage our own bodies around our sexuality, or in another sort of less intimate space, how we decide where we live, who we work with, where our kids go to school, who benefits from my bake sale. So I want to consider two areas of our lives that I think that show both how theology is necessary and perhaps abandoned our bodies to the conformity of society. And I think this is true for progressive theology, so-called, and for conservative theology. So I want to lay out very briefly how I think we've been abandoned to be conformed to a consumeristic, capitalist spirituality. And we've actually abandoned our bodies, both our social body and our intimate body, our sexual body, to the forces that misshape us and malform us, that we've actually created the ideal situation in which capitalism and consumerism can take us over. The analogy for me is to think about that parable in Luke, right? This terrible parable, right? Where Jesus says, there's situations where you cast out the demons, and so the demon leaves, and you sweep the house, and it's all clean and pretty so that more demons can come right in. And I feel like that's a lot of actually the bad news of my talk, right? Is that I think that both in its progressive and its conservative forms, theology has done just that. And what's filled that space is what's the driver of our economics, our socioeconomics of capitalism and consumerism. So what do I mean by that? And then I'm going to say, I think that one of the great opportunities of our education, in person and online, is to take seriously the material realities of the bodies, both maybe in this room, but also for those, the ways that these pressures are unique within your particular space. You don't have to come to seminary. You don't have to take your body here to explain to me how your neighborhood is organized at home. You can actually maybe even do that better when you're online and begin to see some of these dynamics. So we can talk a bit about some of the advantages, I think, actually, of online education if we can do this well. So in brief, I would say I particularly pick up on the paper talking about women and the sexual experiences of women, how women are sexualized, how women are given a line that we are actually free. We are more free, right? We've been sexually liberated. We can take the pill, and isn't that awesome? Because now we're no longer beholden to men. But there's more and more evidence, and interestingly, I try to read as much evidence not from Christians explicitly, right, about this as I can, right? Because I know they're going to be sort of biased in certain directions. It's pretty clear that as Christine Emba, who's a Washington Post columnist in her recent book, Rethinking Sex, one of the titles of her chapters is something like, women were having sex, but we're miserable. And the reality is that what drives the expectations placed on women is a sexual economy that, oh, shocking, is actually set up for male preferences. Now, here's the thing about theology, right? We knew that. We read Genesis. Hello. We know that one of the dull patterns of evil, because evil's always damned boring. Augustine, all right, taught us that or highlights that. But we should know to be watching for these patterns. But we've forgotten that. We've sort of said, you know what? In our progressive theological circles, it's all about autonomy and justice. As long as you say, yes, girl, you're good to go. In conservative circles, and we can go down this bunny trail if you want to, but purity became shrunken to this kind of conception that actually also conforms, remarkably, to a very particular story of sexual purity that is sort of the worst of male domination, that is a really nice way to make sure that the shame that's mentioned in Genesis gets perpetuated in perpetuity, largely on women, but also often sometimes on men. So what I find is that in conservative circles, we don't want to actually name what's going on. We don't want to talk about that a lot of our students and a lot of us are watching porn or have been influenced by porn or struggling with porn. And even if we never watch porn, the reality is that our sexual practices and the economy has actually shifted. It's been reshaped by a marketplace in which sex is now produced and put forward in ways that has shaped us even if we never watch it. And sociologists are documenting this actually pretty clearly. Interestingly, a lot of psychologists are seeing this in their offices, right? What's happening to sexual practices and preferences. And in reality, women are adapting to this because we can go into this, the economics of sex, but sex is really cheap. It turned out that freeing women meant that we can sell sex really cheaply. Women, well, yeah, we can go down this bunny trail, but sex is a resource that women have that men want in a heteroerotic economy. If you don't believe that, ask yourself how many women you know who pay for sex. We don't. We get paid for sex. Whether that payment is a dinner or whether that payment is marriage, it used to be a really high cost, right? It used to be things like marriage, right? And there used to be the risk of pregnancy. That was a really high price. So now we're very free to autonomous consent and free to sell ourselves cheap. And if we don't participate in that game, we're pretty consistently reminded that we're probably repressed and probably not all that free and probably not all that in touch with our authentic sexual self. Now, just as a little side, right? How do we know that this is actually being propagated? So I went to Instagram as an example and looked at the top like 10 or 12 sites on Instagram. Like who has the most followers? Does anybody know? Does anybody want to name one? Kim Kardashian is one of the top 10, yes. Now, what do you think is mostly on Kim Kardashian's pages? Just take a guess. Yes, Heidegger makes a big appearance, very thoughtful reflection. Right, it's boobs, butts. Now, interestingly, if you look at, so Kylie Jenner is another, there's a kind of family thing going on here. Actually, Leo Messi is another.
Cristiano's the most.
Who,
Cristiano Ronaldo.
That's right, Ronaldo has the most. And
lots of abs.
And exactly, on Ronaldo's page, it's abs. Oh man, that man, yeah, that's eye candy. Who says women aren't visual? Come on. But all of them, when you look on those sites, here's an interesting thing. Not only are most of them literally bearing their bodies, but they're selling something. Often selling themselves. The message, not so subtly, is you purchase these products from Kylie Jenner, or The Rock is coming out with a line. Leo Messi has a line. You can be like me. You can have butt, abs, and this many million Instagram followers. A little side note to that, there's something called, women are so free right now that there's something called Instagram face. you'll notice that if you look at Kylie Jenner, Kim Kardashian, and many other faces on Instagram, they're starting to look really similar because they're having plastic surgery to make sure that they look the part of the consumable woman. But they're free, right? They're sex positive. So that's an example. Move on to segregation. Okay, so I'll throw that bunny trail out there.
Can you also bring this back to theological education?
So in theological education, I think we don't talk about this. So I think most of our students go through their theology courses on theological anthropology. They study Genesis, look at men and women, and never ask, so where is this pattern of partnership, of consuming one another, of wrong consumption, which is right there in Genesis, right? The sin of seeing and desiring wrongly. How does that become embedded in relationships between men and women? If we're studying theological anthropology, if we're interested in justice, well, if we're teaching about justice, where do we see those injustices in familial organization, in our sexual partnerships? What are we taking in if we have a theology of economics and justice? Then let's not just look at this in a highly theoretical level of analyzing and saying bad capitalism, but let's actually look at what are we doing with our time? What are we consuming with our eyes, our desires? How are we training and retraining our longings? How are we being honest and befriending our sexuality in ways that are not beholden to a capitalist economy? And I think in progressive circles, that's also not something we want to ask. You want to be as sex positive and rally the flag as much as you can and affirm that, right? But another example would be in preaching. So how do you preach to a congregation when you know 75 to 90% of everybody in that congregation has watched porn in the last at least month, 6 months, or run up against it, had it land in your inbox, right? I was listening to KLOS because my son had been in the car, and it was making sure that I knew that bigger could be better, and there was a penile enlargement guy who was advertising just on the radio, right? So dudes aren't absent this consumer mentality either. But how do you preach? How do you preach in a way out of the Older Testament, which actually talks about body parts quite a bit? Check out Leviticus. Jesus actually talks about bodies and hands and children. Well, he's also partly talking about things like pederasty. He's talking about pedophilia. He's talking about how boys were used, how girls were used, were prostituted. He lives in a culture in which that happened a lot. There was a really vibrant prostitution economy in Jesus' Rome and Palestine. Yeah.
Do you
Move
mind?
on.
No. You're doing great. But do you mind if I sort of let Wilmer come in? Because
No.
I think you're going to have more amazing things to say.
Sorry, I got
No,
rolling
I
there.
just want to make
Got
sure
rolling.
that Wilmer and
Oh, I
Robert
should've
get a
watched.
chance before we all sort of also chime in. So Wilmer and then Robert.
Aaron, thank you for the invitation. Actually, the question I have for you is, you see culture as a way that Paul is calling us to challenge, to invite people to another way. And the patterns of culture, I'm curious to know how you define a pattern of culture and how your proposal for your chapter will help Fuller to give the place of the body in our practice as educators and recognize that we have dedicated and devoted our efforts to our intellect. How would you craft an appeal, this passion that I sense, that will help us faculty members, to descend from our minds into our bodies and make the connections that our students are looking for, but sometimes we are unable to do it because of our own constraints culturally or patterns that you mentioned, and how we can correct or change those patterns so that we can be more effective educators.
Well, that was an easy question, Wilmer. In terms of what culture is, I mean, it's, as you would probably actually have a better off-the-cuff definition than I do, but of course, culture are all the things that we don't have to think about that's considered normal, and we can talk about how that becomes hard to navigate, right, for certain peoples. But that can be ways of communicating, that can be in what's considered normal and unquestioned. What I'm asking, Wilmer, is how in theological education, how can we as colleagues begin to ask students to consider the material embodied practices, like literally what's their body feeling like on their social media feed, as they view, like one example would be asking colleagues to consider how do you weave into your work encouraging students to pay attention to what they're consuming in terms of what they're watching. And indeed, I would say one of the things I would encourage people to do is actually pay attention to how women are portrayed and perceived. This is all over Scripture. It's all over all of our fields, whether that's psychology, theology, preaching. We have these opportunities to consider the material and literally body practices, embodied presence to one another, and not be afraid. I mean, I don't know how you're going to do it, Wilmer, right? But part of what we need to be doing is talking with one another about and encouraging each other to analyze the culture that we're part of, as well as fostering that in students, right? Because I have students who are in Jamaica, students who are in Eastern Europe, right? They're facing this and facing it in different ways. But the advantage is evil's boring, right? So these patterns reappear, they just take different sorts of forms in different cultures, right? So how do we do that? I think one thing I would love for us to do is talk more together across disciplines so that we can gain ideas about how do we craft learning activities and assignments that aren't voyeuristic. Right? This is one of the dangers about talking about sex and porn. For example, it can become just like another kind of consumable and sexy, rather than pedagogical, informative, and counterformative. So one is talking to each other about these sorts of things, as well as talking with our students, and actually the students educate me more than I educate them about what social media is telling them. They're the ones who clue me in and say, here's what's happening in my world. Here's an example. So it's some of what, Wilmer, you talk a lot about this, right? Being someone who's a guide and listening to students and affect. So we'll get to that when we talk about your stuff.
Robert.
Thank you so much, Aaron. It's so good to reconnect after a long time and to learn from you. My question has to dig in more with the social media question. And I share a story. So one of my colleagues invented a certain field of study, a whole field, developed a class about this field that they invented, but went to class one day and got canceled by their students because whatever the teacher was teaching in class did not conform with whatever they read on social media, on Instagram or whatever the night before. I imagine the same thing is true in theological education, right? And I totally agree with your premise that theological education is so valuable because it can help us and our students to sift this conformity, right, with society. But what do we do when social media has such a toxic grip? How do we convince students that theology has that power? Because I'm sure that, like, in our classes, like say at Fuller, we're going to say like a million things that disagree with their social media feed. And I know that's a complicated question. We probably have different experiences with it, but I want to just present that. Thank you.
So I think of my colleague Cutter Calloway and some of how Cutter, at least as I understand it, often encourages people to counter-create or to create an alternative, to tell a different story, right? So one of the possibilities that we can be thinking about is how do we encourage and foster in students an alternative sort of creation in social media? What's the TikTok video or what's your Instagram feed actually put out another desirable, right? Because I think the assumption, and you're a good evangelist, Robert, and you know this, part of what a good evangelist does, or preacher, or even exegete does, is puts out there something that people want. There's another aesthetic beauty that men and women want, other than the dullness and the predictability of much of what's being offered. So some of it is go for the aesthetic, right? Go for the beautiful, go for the different, go for the... And our students are going to be better at doing that than I'm going to be. My job is to say, what might that be? What's your counter creation? What's the beautiful that's not just Instagram face and the butt, the boob thing? What about that poem that you wrote about stretch marks and the beauty of crow's feet? They're like I have friends who write about these sorts of things to counter create, right? And provoke a hunger for something else. What is it that evil's promising but isn't fulfilling?
Yeah, I think when I read your paper, one of the things that I found myself thinking about is to actually acknowledge the bodies, acknowledge breasts, vaginas, penises, testicles, all those things. I love being able to say those words out loud. And as a psychologist, I get away with that a little bit more in class. But also to not allow it to stay so disembodied in that way. And what you just named about naming it as desire, naming it as longing, encouraging people to think about what is it that they long for? What is it, that place that's the deep desire that expresses itself sexually, that expresses itself in arousal, but also is about connection, is also about being known, is also about being safe and being vulnerable. And because I think one of the things from a psychological perspective I'd want to name about Instagram is that we're shaping our brains when we look at things. And so it actually does need to be a very explicit counter action to stop, because we continue to shape ourselves in those ways. So by encouraging a discipline of stopping or limiting or reducing, and then also acknowledging some of the deep desire piece of that and encouraging people to think beyond. And I think in our classes, like you just said, in theological education, in integrative education, to acknowledge that that's all happening even in the moment. Yeah.
Aaron, I want to go back to something you were getting at earlier, and I must say I am enjoying your sermonizing, so thank you very much. I'm curious, what are some of the concrete practices, if you could elaborate on more, what are some of the concrete practices or exercises that you invite students into to interpret culture? And I'm especially thinking about preaching. What are some of the practices that preachers might engage in to not just exegete the text, but to exegete the culture in which they're preaching in?
Yeah, so something I added after what you probably read is it's a kind of adaptation of an assignment that I give called Reading Through a Theological Lens. And students take an artifact that comes in it has to be like in their news feed or whatever they watch or whatever they have, whatever they consume, right? And I ask them to analyze it basically according to a series of questions around things like the centrality of story, right? So this is where it very much connects to preaching. And stories have plots. They have problems that are being solved, right? What's the problem that's implicit or explicit in this ad or in this story? And what's the solution being offered? I have a series of questions for students to distance themselves a bit, right? So that prism gets held up, and then say, okay, how might I read this alongside someone who's not a Christian? So how could this artifact actually be not a point of disconnection and judgment necessarily only, right? But a way of saying, wow, I noticed that in this feed, this is what it seems to be pulling in me. This is the hook, right? Does it hook you in that way too? Like, and is that really true? Like, if I wear that makeup or I got that butt job, do you think it would change my life in that way? I mean, for whatever, right? Trying to get students to see culture as this entry point. And so storytelling and analyzing of the story being told explicitly or implicitly in cultural artifacts is a key assignment, I think, for many of us.
So I want to jump in as a missiologist. I teach a class on globalization. And part of the globalization debate is whether globalization is an indoctrination by the West of everyone else, or whether, as Jehu Hanselis says, people are very capable of standing up for themselves and discerning, coming from their own cultural roots. And then there's this conversation about enculturation as a dialogue between cultures. So I was thinking about the opportunity of the globalization conversation. And I was also thinking about the ways that we are formed as communities and not just as individuals. Mm-hmm. So there's lots of layers to this thing. And I'm just wondering how you incorporate some of those layers.
So one of the things that we talk a lot about in my classes would be partly learning from people like you, right, is that there are opportunities within communities to identify counter formation, right? What are the resources within your community and your culture that might actually be pushing back on some of these things? Or that might be causing dissonance in you as you're sort of being lured into this. I do disagree. I do want to say I disagree with Jehu Hanselis, and that's basically because I believe brains are lazy, right? That brains, because we're efficient, right? We're trying to be efficient. And so the path of least resistance is actually the one we will go down. And globalization has many goods, but it is commodifying a culture that we're being encouraged to take in that is a particular strand of largely Western understanding. So where I'd push back is to say, if we think that, oh, no, people are perfectly capable of standing up for themselves, like, well, no, actually we're not. I mean, I can say that, so let me just say, if you say that to women in your congregation and go, you know what, you're perfectly capable of standing up for yourself. Well, part of that is true. I mean, I'm a fairly strong woman, right? But I'll also tell you that's not true. Even as a strong woman, it gets to be too much, and it's too damn lonely, and it's too damn hard to do by ourselves. So we have to create even, I think this is maybe something that you're getting at, we do need pockets of counterformation and resistance that have to be communal. And part of why I want theology and theologians to learn from our psychologist friends is to say, how do we do that together? Even around things that are so tender, like sex, right? It has to be treated with a kind of tenderness. So, I mean, there's so much we could talk about around the globalization and sexuality and, yeah. So I'm going to push a bit on the negative side, but there are some definite goods.
Just a quick thank you for Cynthia for the words you used earlier. I tweeted them out and gave you tribute for it. So look for that on your Twitter feed. Thank you.
Come to Fuller.
I really appreciated your thought process on this about maybe theological education and the church in general has abandoned our bodies in how we teach, how we live, how we do church life, and that it was like our abandonment of it that allowed this vacuum to form that consumerism, capitalism, and eventually these dysfunctional expressions of social media filled. I mean, that image is very powerful, that they didn't invade us, we withdrew, and then the forces were there. And then now there's a captivity to that. I do want to think about what does that look to take that back, because I feel like one of the ways we've thought about it in the West, in the US, is, well, let's take over social media, right? Let's, create new platforms or new ways of, let's make our Instagram the top 10 rather than Ronaldo and Kim Kardashian.
Which is just so unlikely.
It's sad.
It's never going to happen.
Yeah, it's very sad because then we've got, Franklin
Except
Graham
that you and
shirtless.
I look a lot like
No, that's not
Ronaldo
happening.
and Kim.
So we've got all these attempts. What's a healthier attempt that reclaims that embodiment? Doesn't go into the capitalistic, consumeristic battles, but actually creates an alternative narrative of embodiment.
Yeah. So I'm an Anabaptist, so in that way, I'm not always as interested in being effective as being faithful. That said, I think faithfulness is effective, right? We trust that God does with these seeds of faithfulness, of counter formation, what God is going to do. So how we do that, I do actually think the parable of the seed is the opposite, right? God puts these seeds in us and changes, brings forth fruit that we don't expect and that we probably can't see when we're up there preaching for most of us, little bitty churches, or we're in our little small group, we went to seminary and you're going to broker this conversation around cultural artifacts or consumption of news feeds. I do think there are people who, part of why I think theological education is crucial is there are people who have big impact, right? I mean, Tim Keller, he has a lot of impact. There are large Korean American churches where you can have a lot of impact. And I want to get to those people. I want them to come to places like Fuller and know that they have to be preaching and thinking and teaching and forming small groups that are going to counterform their congregants. We can go off on this, but I don't think that just doing what the world does better, no offense, but we're never going to do it. And there's all kinds of reasons for that. But it doesn't mean that we don't create the beautiful, the true, and the desirable. That absolutely we are about that. And we've got to trust that when we put that out there, there are enough people, right? It's like casting the seed out, right? The parable of the sower. There are people who are like, this is it. It's not up to me to decide if that takes root. It's up to God to grow the seed. But I feel like we're not even tossing out the seeds, right? Theology is just basically offering what everybody else offers, which is a disembodied, have the right position on sex, purity, sex positive. Woohoo! Okay, now that's it. You've been able to put that up on your Facebook or Instagram. You've taken the right stand, and it completely leaves the body untouched. No habits of mind, no habits of body, no habits of relationship, and leaves us lonely.
Thank you so much, Aaron. You always provoke us to much interesting conversation. And so this is connected to what Cynthia said earlier, but I was thinking about when you said, what are we doing with our time and how are we training and reframing our longings? And I think that the church and Christian theology Western Christian theology at least, does not do a good job with desire and longing. So you're talking about what is the longing behind those posts or behind that kind of consumption? I think that's a great question, but even deeper, in the congregational setting, we do not know how to flesh out the flesh. We talk about holiness, but what about holiness in the flesh? And I think that that's a place where we can begin in the congregational setting, in the pulpit, in our Bible studies I feel like kids, even my own kids whom I'm trying to, be different, right? I think that when they think about desire, they're kind of afraid to talk about it. That it's a privatized, dark, secret space, or a very public social media, yet not in the church space. That the church and the flesh and God's desire and body, there's not an invitation to put that out there, warts and all, perversions and all as well. And so I think that you're provoking me to think about how that dichotomy between holiness and fleshiness can be more integrated in the context of ministry. the classroom too.
Well, and just to pick on your discipline, right? Part of what is so great about the Bible is the Bible actually talks about that a lot. Shows us, right, how longings go awry all the time. If you look, especially at the Older Testament, right, those stories that we don't like to read around, so say overtly, sexual violence. What's actually going on with Tamar and Amnon? And why does that injustice keep going? It's because David loves his son too much, which is, there's a fascinating, right?
I think you're right. I think there's a lot of examples where desire goes awry, and maybe that's also, and that because that's easy to talk about, but also about desire for God, the longing to be known and found and be whole in God. I think we don't talk about that much. Just the consequence of bad desire, but what are the fruits of holy desire?
So here's one of the things I talk about that throws that I think
I'm also about the Bible, by the way.
I know, huh?
I'm still about the Bible, by the way. I'm not denying that part, but I'm just saying.
Well, okay, so an example is how Jesus talks about desire. One of the fascinating things to me is whenever, I love that people come up to Jesus, I think he's the kind of guy, they come and go, hey, I want you to do something for me. And read through the Gospels, and he never says, no. He says, what do you want? Right? Draws out the desire. And sometimes he meets that desire because he said, oh, I want you to be healed. I do want you to be healed. You are. Sometimes he's engaging in parable. I mean, we can talk about Matthew. But sometimes they go, well, actually, that's not mine to give. But it's really good. He forces the sons of Zebedee, right, to expose their desire and their lust for power. And their misunderstanding, their misdesiring, so that it can be exposed and redirected. So one question that I often ask students is, when Jesus says to you, or what do you ask Jesus for? Like, it just no holds barred. Be like the people who knew Jesus that well and exposed themselves to whatever Jesus was going to say back. And I love that Jesus is much, whatever else he is, for some reason, people around him, women and men of all different stations, feel comfortable asking him that. And I wonder if we're creating spaces, this is something that our brothers and sisters who are psychologists and therapists offer us as gifts, is to teach us to create space in which it's okay to expose that desire. I mean, a la Freud, right? Even Freud knew that desires had to be exposed. And what I tell students is it's like playing whack-a-mole. So most of what the church does around sex and desire is whack-a-mole. Bam! A woman's body, bam! Men's visual cues, bam! Let's just hit that baby down. And every time, right? This was Freud's insight, right? Pops up somewhere else. It doesn't work that way. Desires don't work that way. We are desiring, longing animals. Theological anthropology at its basic.
So let me ask one last question, sort of capturing some great questions. I don't know if they come from the room or online, which during our proper Q&A, which will be after Wilmer's presentation, I will ask the very specific question that you guys have asked. But because they've been brought to Robert, you, and to you, Aaron, they're wonderful questions. But if I can maybe summarize a little bit of a gist, to go back to this practices question, what kind of model or mode of practice for countercultural, action related to the body? So some would say that your seed analogy feels, in practice, it feels defeatist because I'm throwing a seed into a hurricane of inertia, cultural inertia, right? My individual practice will have no dent whatsoever on my family culture, my church culture, my, people culture. Other practices would be the contemporary Christian music world. They did their alternative, music, and they became the same thing, but in a sort of Christian, key. The Amish have an alternate practice of the body, right? So theological education is the topic of our conference. what do we tell our students? What vision of practice of the body is going to neither be the dandelion into the tornado, nor the CCM, nor the Amish? So what is the way forward, Aaron Dufalt
Well,
Hunter?
I noticed that you said, what do we tell students, right? That's part of the problem.
Well,
I'm
what
catching
are
you
we
up.
inviting them into? We have to use words.
So I think that what we have to do is, in our classes and in our classrooms and in our disciplines as appropriate to our content, is ask ourselves a question like, do I think this actually lands in material reality somewhere, like in the nitty gritty of students' lives? Like, who the heck cares about what I'm teaching and why? And it doesn't need to be, well, we can go down the bunny trail of how systematics might seem obscure, right? But actually, all this stuff is deeply rooted in doctrine of the faith, right? So one thing I think is the work actually perhaps comes first onto us as theologians to remind ourselves of our own bodies, our own material realities. We didn't talk about segregation, that we're basically enacting and embodying racism in where we live. It's an ordinary, everyday experience. And I want to ask theologians to consider, how do you live with your body? What does that mean to you? In what ways has it cost you to be Christian with the body that you have? That raises all kinds of aspects, right? Of culture, ethnicity, money, sex. Right? That's kind of an equal opportunity offender. And I think once we begin to think about what's God's invitation to us with our own bodies and what's been difficult for me, I think we can then also design assignments that get at some of those things for our students. But I honestly think that in this, I mean, maybe this is a cheap shot, but unless we as theologians actually begin to support each other in doing education differently in these ways, Robert raised this, right? It's not going to change because it's not rewarded. You're cute, you're clever, but that's not really what we're about. But if we are implicated in our own theological education and re-embodying in ourselves, that's one thing that students will see as appropriate. We expose that, we illustrate for students, and then we say, now what's your task? This is just one illustration. Illustrations are not models, right? They're not reproductive. Students don't reproduce us. But we can invigorate their imaginations and say, here are some examples from my life, from saints who pay a lot of attention to the body, as you know. So that's one. The last one I'll just throw out is to create communities, and sometimes we can do that actually online. So like an organization I'm part of called the Ecclesia Project, we don't live near each other, but we all feel a kind of ecclesial homelessness often where we are. And the advantage of online is that we can connect some to encourage each other to the kind of counterformation that, to be blunt, most of our churches aren't interested in. And that's one of the great gifts of online education, and online as a thing.
That's wonderful. Thank you, Aaron, so much. We really, really do appreciate all your thoughts and questions. And at this point, we're going to take a 15-minute break. We will return at the top of the hour. We will start on time, so please get your bodies back in your chairs or wherever you are at home. Keep your questions coming. We will ask them as they have come. But thank you, Robert, Aaron, for starting us off. Wilmer, we look forward to hearing from you in just a few minutes. All right, thanks so much. Andy Root, who is one of our special guests. He's not in the room, is he yet? No. His flight was canceled because of thunderstorms in the upper Midwest, but he landed in LA this morning and is on his way and should be here in the next few minutes. So when he arrives, if you guys see him, Tell them to come on down. But at this point, let me just mention two things before I welcome and introduce Wilmer. If you see some humans missing, not the rapture, we are actually filming each person after their presentation. So there's a videographic record of some of these exchanges. So they will take turns exiting to go film. And then Seung-chan had to take his son to school, which is a good embodied practice of care. So with that said, Wilmer Villacorta is Associate Professor of Intercultural Studies at Fuller Theological Seminary, and his remarks were pre-recorded. So thank you, Wilmer, and we look forward to hearing those right now, and then we'll entertain questions. Thanks, Wilmer.
Thank you for the opportunity to share with you this morning. Let us be honest. We have practiced and promoted this embodied learning long before using online technologies, ages before the global pandemic. Let us admit that the term embodied learning may sound like another buzzword among many others that we have today. The literature on embodiment in learning defines it as the integration of the physical or biological body and the phenomenal or experiential body. And this suggests a seamless, though often elusive, matrix of body-mind worlds, a web that integrates thinking, being, doing, and interacting within the worlds. The notion of a disembodied age did not begin with the rise of the internet. John Dewey, a philosopher, psychologist, and educator, traced this dichotomy of body and soul in Pauline Christianity. It portrays the human body as earthy, fleshly, lustful, and passionate, instead of godlike, everlasting spirit. It denotes the distinction between the corruptible flesh and an incorruptible spirit. Therefore, we can assert that this dichotomy has shaped our thinking for more than 2 millennia. It has constrained learning to a single domain, the intellect. The distant intellectuals from life, the separation of knowledge and practice, the supremacy of the mind over body, and theory versus praxis, all these testify to the need to see the mind-body as integral. This paper proposes a change of worldview or a new mental model from the mind versus body scheme to the body-mind paradigm. One word, body-mind. Therefore, rather than encouraging learning as information overload, the potential and promise of effective learning are possible when the educator releases power misconstructions and cultural biases that preserve and foster disembodied instruction. Embodied learning in a disembodied age requires a fresh look at how seminarians can learn beyond the limitation of cognitive learning alone. Educators must look at how they have been taught, because this experience informs their teaching practice, believe it or not. This aims to provide insights into how educators can reframe their teaching practices in more holistic ways, a la Bloom's learning taxonomies, for instance, in every modality, that is hybrid, online, and in person. We need to vulnerably admit that we conform to the norms given by our sociocultural context where we grew up, which forced us to live out and defend assumptions, reacting instead of responding to disruptions, and self-defeating instead of equipping, empowering the educator's perspective on embodied learning. Now, admitting assumptions will enable an educator to assess mental models and power practices that discourage affective learning. Once admitting conformities, finding liberation from mental models that foster cognition over affection and detachment over engagement will enable an educator to elevate
affective learning by furthering students' participation in their context with creative imagination and reflection action participation. Unfortunately, Western constructions of education proliferated top-down models of teaching and learning, which Brazilian educator Paulo Freire has challenged. Now, affective teaching must precede affective learning. First, a vulnerable educator must immerse herself in the diverse interplay of causing students to learn in ways that relate to their emotions, affections, attitudes, and biases. Then, educators must set the pace by modeling affective learning to students who will require primarily a resetting of cultural bias to challenge disembodied learning. Releasing power and cultural conditioning will take place by adopting three considerations. First, acting on practices that modify the role of the educator as a guide, what I call horizontality. Second, working as a dialogue agent, and I call this mutuality. Third, becoming a promoter of peer-to-peer, peer-to-teacher interactions, relationality. Finally, moving beyond the comforts of one's culture, a vulnerable educator will cause learning to happen in any modality by moving students' heart's affection through storytelling, inner life formation, and promoting relationships of trust and closure. And I want to remind us ourselves in Acts 24:32. The disciples said to each other, "Were not our hearts burning within us while he was talking to us on the road, while he was opening the scriptures to us?" May this be an encouragement to be educators that engage the whole of a person in the life of our students here at Fuller Seminary. Thank you for your time.
That's wonderful. Hey, Wilmer, there you are. The man himself. Hey, Robert, you're in a different setting. Your body's in a different place. I just wanted to note that.
My office just moved because you know how it is in this type of disembodied age.
That's good. Hey, so Wilmer, here's my question to start us off. It sounds like on one side you have this invulnerable thinker in the classroom, educator, the sage who communicates ideas through monologues to other humans in the room. And on the other side, you have these other, qualities that you've commended to us. I'm wondering if you can show us what this side looks like in an example from your teaching. I think it'd be helpful to see the idea of it played itself out in your own teaching, if that's possible.
Of course, thank you for the question. I would say that students appreciate a story of a life. And what I first do in every class that I have, an opportunity for students to get to know a person that is on the journey of wrestling with one course that I teach on power and gender, my assumptions, my biases, my stories of how I became aware of the imbalance, the asymmetry of power in the lives of myself as a pastor, also as a professor, that I can share from the heart, from a places sometimes of pain, places of loss, or displacement. As an immigrant, I'm able to share the story of my own shortcomings, my own desires to be somebody who I am not, like what Robert was saying, that idea of the white male, middle class attainment or goal for me. There's something that students get to know and learn, and listening to an accented English speaker, that this is what I am about. And I'm coming here to level the field. I'm here to learn from you. And when you say something like that to a student, especially in most of my classes that have been online, there's an openness, there's a pathway that opens for students to see, well, this guy is disarming my assumptions about, well, this guy is just, sage on the stage, and this one is a platform, but they get to know my journey. So I have PowerPoints and show pictures of my own journey with my family, with my kids, and in moments where I had great opportunities to acknowledge pain in my life, pictures of losses in my family that at times are moving me as I speak. So students hear in an open office hours my heart, and I do try to do that the first week, where students get to know the humanity that I bring into my virtual class. And so that's something that I do intentionally, and is part of my first week of classes, where I open my heart. Students get to know me, because there's invulnerability. There is an open pathway that creates mutuality. And when they see it from the person that is supposed to be the facilitator of the learning process, there's an opportunity for them to say, hey, I want to lower my guard and want to engage and invite them to do the same in the small groups. And believe it or not, there comes a moment where people's experience and heart and minds are knitted in this common story of loss, joy, and it's beautiful to see that at the end of 10 weeks when we debrief, that there are new relationships and new partners in the courses at Fuller that they try to emulate and try to get together to continue on a journey together. So that's something that I do intentionally, and that is why the title of my chapter will be The Vulnerable Educator. And I think that for me is one of my core values as I started teaching at Fuller on the first online degree, as you all know.
I have just a quick follow-up question, but whoever would like to go next, please do so. Can I ask you, Wilmer, just a direct question? I love what you're talking about. And as somebody who's a pastor, I love making that possible in a congregational context. But how does this model make theological education better? If I can put it in those kind of crude terms.
There's a topic that I cover in one of my courses, and it has to do with God's pathos, it's loving, suffering love for the world. And the best picture I can have is that God reveals himself, herself in the person of Jesus Christ, who embodies our humanity, and it debunks all our theories about power, glorious, the all-sufficient male, and for me, that is the beginning of why it's important. It's that aspect of the invitation that I give students is participate in God's suffering love that invites us to open our lives, confess our shortcomings, and become a community of beloved learners that are committed to bring freedom, to bring justice, to bring forgiveness. And in a world that is divided, in a world that is hungry for a new humanity, I think for me, it's one of those aspects that are rooted in who God is. And this is an invitation that I do to my students. And of course, I always get people that resist, but even in that resistance, in that pushback, there is an opportunity to say, hey, maybe you're uncomfortable about this idea of God being vulnerable in Christ. And maybe for you to explore, there is something that is inhibiting you from being to be vulnerable, to share, and to be in small groups. Tend to be, in my classes at least, very connected to stories where people had to share moments in which somebody overpowered them by doing such and such thing, and that creates ignites a desire for everyone, a desire again to be able to share and to open their hearts. And I've seen tears. I've seen moments in which people laugh, and even in a virtual environment, my students can testify. Many times they come up very moved, And that is something that is rewarding to see happening in an environment that many times is disembodied. But I'm sure that there's more to be done. And I hope that that's something that some of you can help me to craft and to probably have a better exchange of practices that will help or build on what I've done so far.
Andy, thou hast traveled the valleys, the shades, the trials and tribulations, and here you are. We are so glad that you are here with us. So thanks for hanging in with all those hindrances to you being here. So welcome. Yeah. Is his microphone, does he need to flick it on, or is he, yeah, okay, flick up. There you go. Is it tap, tap, tap? There you go. There we go. Welcome.
Yeah.
It was only awkward for half a second, and now we're good.
Now that the mic doesn't work, it's even more awkward. Yeah.
Okay. Any other questions for Wilmer? Alexia.
So I'm going to ask a very vulnerable question. There you are, over there, because you really inspire that in me, Wilmer. It's very risky what you are calling educators to do. I was just having a flash memory of about 15 years ago when I was teaching in an undergrad context and a fairly new professor. I mean, I'd been a pastor most of my life. And I had a young white kid just apoplectic with anger. And he said to me, "You don't understand. Your job is to give us information, not to change us." And I went, woo. And I realized that maybe if I was a white man saying the exact same thing I had said, I would not have provoked the same reaction. So for some of us, it's much riskier to be vulnerable than others. And then I jumped to another thought, which was in our small groups, and Cynthia are going to talk about our class later this afternoon. We asked people to share in a trauma and faith class on some very vulnerable things. And we got some pushback. Right. Not just from the people who had an intellectual vision of the work, but people saying to us, "This is not safe. You are putting us in we are vulnerable people and you are putting us in an unsafe situation." Right. And so how do we manage I'm Lutheran. I believe that we live in the two kingdoms. We live in this world where, sometimes you turn your other cheek and you convert the other person, and sometimes you just, the baby gets killed. So, how do we manage this in the complexity of this world?
Well, thanks for the question. I think we need to be very sensitive to that. I've encountered as the past 2 years since the pandemic started, people feeling we're very, very sensitive to that. Many aspects of difficulties experiencing being in quarantine for so long. Some of our students have experienced a lot of trauma just by being in those conditions. So what I've developed is an opportunity to connect with them through a personal email. When I read the feedback or read their assignments, I could tell that there is some sensitive areas that I noticed that could be that pushback coming, because the pushback has come. And so it's because of people being afraid of disclosing information that are very sensitive. I have amazing TAs who have gone through that, and they modeled, that embodied the moments in which they were in many ways liberated from the shame. And I connect students with my TAs who have gone through that. So that kind of releases the expectations that I expect students to share their stories of pain in the class or a small group. So I have processes in which I work in determining and discerning if there are moments in which I can approach a student and say, "Hey, I know your story is very personal, and I want to give you different opportunities to share in different levels." And that's the role that I sometimes allow TAs that are well equipped in this area. And sometimes, I wish, you're talking about team teaching, that I can do this with a professional psychologist who can co-teach with me and help me to navigate and those risks, because this is very, very delicate. And the more especially now coming out in a post-pandemic era, you find a lot of very sensible hearts that are coming to Fuller with hope to get, as you mentioned, get information, because that's all I need. Don't tell me that I need to change. I just need to get a degree. So those are signs that people who come with those attitudes to the classroom, whether in person or hybrid or online, is that they're hungry for something else. And I think our positions as educators is to show a way that is disarming the constructions of, okay, you need to memorize this, you need to do this, you need to get this information right, or telling students what they need when they already know what they want to learn. So those are things that I try to craft and learn myself from the language of domination. Say, I'm here to tell you what you need to learn. I try to change that language to invite students to bring their stories, to bring their context into the environment in the classroom, in a small groups on campus. And it's powerful, it's moving to see the sometimes the joys and the pain, as I said. And those are opportunities. I've been a pastor, and where I can see and exercise those moments in which I can pray, I can empathize with my student that's struggling. And so that shows for me care, pastoral care, and also coming alongside and say, hey, maybe there's something that you here need to learn, and to ask God, what do you want me to change? To answer the question from your students' experience, I don't need to change, I just need information, which is pretty sad.
I'd love to respond, but I'm also aware, I want to make sure that we get from Robert. So should we, because you had talked about having them in.
Yes, Robert.
You can jump on. Thank you. And welcome from my backyard. My question is like the tension between kind of Freirean models like this, which I appreciate and I value, like we do the same thing in Chicano studies, and then like the baseline learning and tensions about that. Because there tends to be a perspective that's common now that says, okay, everybody's perspective is valued, but everyone's perspective is also just equally truthful. I don't know how to say it other than just say it, right? So people will be like, okay, let's vote on every single thing. But how do you deal with that, like with theology, when some people are saying some things that are like very concerning? How do you deal with that tension, those tensions?
The tension specifically about bringing change, about what's exactly the tension that you're referring to?
Maybe just the tensions related to baseline. Maybe I'll keep it really simple. Baseline, like theological understandings of a class, let's say, or baseline theological understandings about God or the Bible or something, right? How do you balance that? Because from a purely kind of Freirean kind of model, well, some people take it to, well, we're all just, each of our opinions is equally valid.
Right. Okay. I see what you. Culturally speaking, we bring to our classroom how we've been taught. So in other words, we teach how we've been taught. And I could see it in myself, how it comes through sometimes when I need to step back and say, hey, I need to, and in reference to Freire leveled the plane for the poor in South America who weren't able to get the education. And many of the aspects that you mentioned that in Latin, in the South of, in the global South per se, in Latin America,
we already went through this deconstruction and reconstruction, and Freire was key in bringing that and challenging the powers that be in terms of education and say, hey, now the poor and the unprivileged and the masses, now they have access to organize, to do community organizing, to speak to power, to come together in communities, and came alongside with, unfortunately, he became the educational voice of liberation theology, and that's what they stigmatize Freire and say, okay, well, it becomes very popular. But what I would argue in favor of Freire is Freire was able to create this pedagogical of desire, or pedagogy of desire, that he really made people to wish and to have a new start. And in a way, I see what a theology of hope in many ways. So and I think this is the beauty of Freire's work. He was deported, and he was basically exiled because of he was challenging the core of a system that the ones with power, with the ones with money, the ones with their fairer skin were the ones who get the privilege. So when we translate that into, okay, how I say this in a way that will help a student coming well, I want to know about theology. Well, I'm not a theologian. I'm a cultural anthropologist. I think missiologically is how I can help this person to critique her own biases against learning from a person of color, or learning from a classmate that it's an undocumented worker. And so in that way, I'm creating bridges in which I'm able to challenge the core of biases, values that students bring to the classroom. One example that usually have students that come from African contexts, and they come really careful to say, okay, what is this guy's going to say? And they assume I'm a white professor, and they have the questions, and then they start hearing me and say, oh, I thought you were, and well, say I'm learning along the way as I go here. And so, and there is a I would say diffusing the expectation to come into a level that I try to make it. This is what I call horizontality, that I'm here to learn with you. You want to learn from me? Why not? And so, and that brings me, for me, that I create this desire in the student to know, why is the professor saying that? And I say, well, I say this because I'm here to facilitate your learning, to connect what you know in the practice in your experiential life, and join it with connected with the theory you're reading right now. Per se, Sun Chan Ra, making, culture, many cultures. So they connecting that, the stories. You have a chapter there, Sun Chan, and where you have the 4 steps of developing stories. Students are amazed about that frame, and they're able to craft their story of a vulnerable experience, or sometimes of a victory. And I could see that happening in the classroom, where our students make those choices depending on their context. And so, so there's from the beginning a leveling the fields in my classrooms, in my experience. So that's something that I value from a Freiring approach.
I'm so appreciative of the ways that you're reminding us and challenging us to consider that learning is an emotional experience. And I want to just say that for all of us. Learning is an emotional experience. And I'm realizing that as coming from teaching out of a clinical psychology department, emotion is part of what we're learning. And it's also connected to how we're learning. And we're also training therapists, so they have to be aware of their own emotions. So this is more of a content, or more of a comment than a question, Wilmer, but in my field, we often talk about, when we're teaching, that there's content and there's process. So the content being the material, and then as, to the point that Robert was making around the professor, the teacher still is responsible for bringing the content to the class and being really thinking about what is the content that the class needs to get, what are the competencies that the students need to learn. That's our responsibility as professors. But we're also responsible to be aware of the process and the emotional experience of the students in the room. So even the choices that we make of the content we bring to the class, and you're describing the content that we bring as being vulnerable and as sharing our own stories, we also need to be aware of the content that is. And I think that maybe unconsciously you're doing that by telling stories that are sort of, you're either in process in or have processed yourself, or sort of feel comfortable sharing in the way that you can be vulnerable and not be undone. And I think that's a really important piece of what we're showing to the students, is you can be vulnerable in these spaces. You can tell those stories and not be undone. Or if they become emotionally provocative and we get emotionally engaged, that we can also create that space to hold you, and share it together and learn together from it. But I want to say this, I'm going to be a little provoking for our colleagues and for those of you who are teachers, is the responsibility to be aware of the emotional process of the class and the content we bring then makes us really think about, why am I choosing this reading? Why am I choosing this author? What's the story of this author? We unfortunately have authors in our compendium of material who have backgrounds of abuse, or who have experiences where they've been oppressors. How do we think about that? Not to say that we don't include that material, but how do we frame it? How do we acknowledge that there's an emotional experience for students in bringing that? Or content that we bring from the web, or movies that we show. How are we thinking about the experience of our students and the emotional process of the learning, so that we're intentional about that content with the outcomes we want to see, acknowledging the process that the students have having. So there we go. That was my little speech.
Thank you, Cynthia.
Hey, Wilmer, just real quick. If we look out this way, it's as if we're giving Wilmer and Robert eye contact, because the cameras are here. I know we want to look over, but they can see us, our faces, if we look that way. So just FYI. Yep. Wilmer, any comments on that before?
Cynthia, thank you for sharing that. I think I cannot say enough about how important it is to, I think, embodied learning has to have the emotional content, the affective response from our students. I think sometimes I feel like the institution pressures us to deliver content, because this is the way we have been doing it for 7 years. So now that we are exposed to a world that is disembodied like this, I'm here right now, but I can sense the fact that we are trying to get to this in this laboratory of conversation and ideas, and our audience are listening, is that I need my psychology colleagues to give us this input. And as I look forward to the team teaching approach that we want to visit as an institution, I would really ask all of us to be open to share. And I think you, Cynthia, and Alexia, and Jude, you have been models to me. And one day I just dreamed to have that partnership that comes together in teaching, where I should stop and say, okay, I have now my colleague who's going to address the area of emotions and trauma, and make our courses in a way that are integrated, not only in paper and theory that we say a lot, but really coming and spreading a consciousness of classes here at Fuller Seminary are embodied in a way that your mind, your emotions, your affections, your volition are at work. And this is where indispensable education comes around. We're trying to define what that means, but it seems to me that the aspect of bringing the whole of a person is crucial for that step into indispensability. I have students that come from cultures, Southeast Asia nations, that they really get a challenge to get to share from the heart deeply, because culturally sometimes they cannot do that. I'm still struggling about if I want my students to call me Dr. Wilmer, Dr. V, or just Wilmer, and that takes time. And I think those are things that, in many ways, can describe a lot of our heart, our passion for teaching, for change. And, you know, Alexia, you mentioned that clear. I mean, I had so many of those encounters that, and I want to say that it keeps reminding me of, we are in a good moment in which, in our experience after 2 years of doing Zoom as a faculty and also as a professors, that we are, I think, on a new way of engaging our students. I think many of you are excellent. I've heard so many of you from you. Teaching has become really, you're engaging. Many of you have done things that I wish I could share from you in my practice. So thank you, Cindy, for those words.
Wilmer, I am mindful of the time that we have. So if it's okay with you, what I'd like to do before we go into general Q&A, Jeanette, Trey, Andy, if you guys have comments or questions, let's just do it all back to back. And then Wilmer, you can hear the questions and kind of negotiate and answer however you wish. But I'd love to give a chance to ask some of the questions that have come from, folks here and online, if that's okay. So Jeanette, we'll start with you.
Thanks, Wilmer, so much for your presentation. I think vulnerability is always I'm always in tension with it a little bit. I long to be vulnerable. I love the idea of vulnerability and God being vulnerable in Christ. And Brene Brown and her famous talk and its effects. But as Willie Jennings and as Robert has talked about, because the pedagogical imagination is indeed shaped by the idea of the self-sufficient white male, I can't help but think that vulnerability is the most effective tool for white male professors and pastors, but it's much more precarious, much more fraught for women of color, people of different socioeconomic statuses. And I think, for example, there are studies that show that women, that Asian American and particularly Asian professors, women professors, are given the least recognition for their academic expertise and their instructional authority in the classroom, irregardless of whether they're in disciplines where they're not underrepresented. And that poses a significant problem with vulnerability as a professional, as a professor, as a pastor. I think it's very ideal to be vulnerable, to create and disarm. But I also think that you have to pay attention to the complex power dynamics that it's hard to take back once you put it out there. And so for myself, you talked about even, there's things that I have to think about. Like when I first started teaching, when I had my first professorship, what do people think when they see me? They're literally like, is she my professor? And how do I make sure they're not necessarily giving me authority by virtue of me entering the room and being the professor of the class? It is actually the base level of expectation of me having expertise or having even something to offer is actually quite low from the get-go. And I think that I'm just naming that reality because it's not, it's very complicated and tender and potentially problematic. It can cause kind of effects that maybe are difficult to reverse. So,
It's good. Andy?
Yeah, thanks. I think maybe my comment, and I came in the middle, so this could be completely unfair, but it would build on that. And is there a sense with the Ferry kind of centrality of him as a thinker, I just always wonder with my own students, there is just this deep implicit sense of kind of the Hegelian slave-master dialectic. And so vulnerability could really be used inside of that dialectic, which becomes a way towards power. And is there another way that vulnerability reveals personhood and honesty in a certain way? But how do we escape this kind of late modern dialectic that I think for Ferry is there, and my students have no idea that they're deeply embedded Hegelians in that way, but completely function that way. That every comment, that every class is really a negotiation of kind of of that kind of dynamic. And their only kind of eschatological vision, and their kind of moral horizons can be to kind of switch power dynamics. And even to the faculty, like the students can take over the administration and can kind of call out the administration. These have been some weird years. And so how do you have a different kind of horizon, whether it's a moral horizon or a theological horizon, that kind of moves beyond the kind of drive of pedagogy is just to raise consciousness to the point that people are aware that there's this hermeneutic of slave master dynamic, and how do you move past it?
Yeah.
Trey?
Yeah, thank you as well, Wilmer. Your paper is so relevant, I believe, for preaching classes. Often communication, public communication is one of the most vulnerable things that people engage in. One of the questions that emerged for me, and it's connected to what Jeanette was gesturing at, and it's how do we help students to perform or engage vulnerability in ways that are culturally sensitive? Specifically, I'm thinking about women who are engaged in preaching in contexts in which their body might be read in ways that are very dehumanizing. And so to invite them into performing or embodying vulnerability in those contexts might perpetuate a very dehumanizing cycle.
All right, Wilmer, easy questions. Give us the easy answer. Okay, you can answer here however you wish, and then we'll open it up to the general questions. So you can join Alexia right there, and then Aaron will eventually join us. Over to you, Wilmer. Last word.
The word power dynamics, it's key in the conversation. I think Paulo Freire defined education as a politics of education, because as soon as you walk into the classroom, whether virtually or in person, you're carrying the credentials, you're carrying your books, you're carrying your fame, per se, if you have it, and that sets your standard. The students are here to just bow, open their heads, and you deposit information. So that, I'm aware of that slave master approach that comes from as I suggested and proposed in my initial video, that we come with those constructions already in place. And of course, it's up to us to relinquish that. That's what I propose, to relinquish our power privilege, as in order to cause students to realize this person is sort of relinquishing those privileges that have been granted to me by the society, by the credentials I have, by the institutions I represent, in order for me to engage this person in dialogue. This is I propose, it comes from Freire, a dialogical agency, in which I said, let's talk about this. Let's get together. So when I had hybrid classes where we're in place, I create this atmosphere where people are just changing their experiences, their information, what they know about a topic. So that releases the tension of, here we are, the professor who professes knowledge and the recipient, the student who knows nothing. And that's why you're coming here. So when we disarm and we challenge that power, then we are creating what I propose, the horizontality. And Freire has compendiums of this. I mean, the research that many people that follow Freire, Freirean school of thought in education, invites us to consider that we need to reset those power dynamics in order to cause students to liberate themselves from those constructions of, okay, I know nothing. That's why I call my professor knows all the answers, and I'm going to get all the answers right for him or her. So those are things that I would say power dynamics, we sometimes do them without even being aware of it. It's very subtle. In terms of vulnerability, I don't think vulnerability has to be only sharing your stories of loss or pain, or it's also being able to be instead of I heard in our conversation so far, I'm not going to tell students what to learn. They come to our classes already knowing a lot, knowing at least sufficiently enough to have conversations about many topics due to the information they have on their hands. the Google, whatever. So they come with some content already. So, and this is what Fuller has done very well in reverting the classroom, flipping the classroom. And so in those opportunities that we need to step aside of our regalia and comes on the side of our becoming a guide by their sides and say, what are you hearing? What are you learning? What do you think it matches what you have done in context? What's the application is of this part of the incarnational theology? How could you apply that in context? Things of that nature that will help us to craft an approach that produces in the student an emotional response that, hey, the professor is saying something that is learning from what I'm saying or I'm sharing. So, for instance, in classrooms when I have a hybrid classes, we put in round tables, and round tables. Students are engaged in the conversation, and I just sit next to them or just stand and say, yeah, I interact with them. And I say, yeah, that's a good point. I really appreciate you saying that. And students kind of look at me as like, you're listening to me or you're listening to us. And my contribution to their conversation in terms of I'm learning this from you opens new perspectives for them, instead of for me standing on a podium and lecturing to them. So this idea about lecturing and dialoguing, the monologue or dialogue approach will help us also to bring some aspects of vulnerability, because it takes, I think Paulo Freire wrote, the students are the ones who determine when the death of the professor comes. And the death of the professor is something that I hated to hear in Freire's and Vela's and Knoll's, writings, because the challenge was there. I have to die to myself, to the glorious approaches of being a known professor. But the death of the professor is the moment in which a new opportunity for learning that is effective, embodied, comes through, especially. And now to answer the question on preaching, I think one of the things that I've seen, and it's beautiful to see, students that come from classes try to do the approach in preaching in which they share a moment of in their stories, the narratives of when preachers share their hearts. I don't know if you experienced that, but the preachers that I've heard that impacted and I remember the most are the ones who share those stories of openness and vulnerability, especially when it comes from white male preachers. I mean, I could count with my hands 5 of them who were incredibly vulnerable in the kind of stereotyped that I had about them, kind of dissolved, because there's something powerful about being yourself, being honest about your own journey. So, and I think that's intentional, that this rooted again on power dynamics, on the power dynamics that we already have as we walk into that first day of class, online, hybrid, or in person. And that's the opportunity for us to foster this mutuality, relationality, and horizontality in our experience, in order for students to effectively learn.
Thank you. Thanks for your thoughtfulness. I love that image of your body posture, sitting, leaning in, very much communicating so much in one gesture. Okay, so we are coming towards the end of our morning time. I think we might have time for 3 questions. One, Robert, one for you, Aaron, one for you, and then one more for you, Wilmer. So Robert, this question is for you. Somebody asks the question, many students of color come from schools, both high school and colleges, that did not adequately prepare them for the academic rigor of graduate school. Should we relax and lower academic standards to accommodate this systemic injustice, or is there a better alternative? How would you like to answer that question, Robert?
I guess I resist the approach of the question. I think I understand what the question means, but I think that, again, that's a deficit model. that sort of saying, oh, these students of color, it's a nicer version of it, but it's like they come with these deficits of, and, there are some of those kind of questions. Okay, well, some folks didn't get trained enough to write or didn't get that structured training and so forth. So those are legitimate questions, but I'd like to ask, what's to go back to the community cultural wealth framework, what's the distinct community cultural wealth that many students of color bring in all their diversity? And I think if our gaze is focused on that, oh my gosh, we're going to be overwhelmed by the glory and honor that is there. And then I feel like then from that perspective, I'm there to coach, to encourage, those students to be fully flourish. And I've seen that, in my doctoral students at UCLA. And so that's what I would say. I would shift the approach and focus on the community cultural wealth. There are those certain pedagogical realities, but let's have a different starting point.
That's fantastic. Thank you, Robert. All right, Aaron, a question for you about this practice of countercultural ways of being in our bodies together. So it's an interesting question, which is, what questions should we ask ourselves to be able to discern and to be grounded in these new practices or life-giving practices? So I don't think it's so much like what practices, but what questions should we be asking? I mean, this is maybe for general Christians in general, abroad. I don't know if you want to address us as educators about the kinds of questions we should ask ourselves in order to discern the kinds of practices that will enable us to be countercultural, formatively life-giving.
So I'm trying to think if it's Mother Teresa that I'm about to sort of semi-plagiarize here, but or some great saint who said something like, if the way that I'm living makes a lot of sense without Jesus, I'm probably missing something big. And I ask myself that question to try to comprehend, am I living in a way that really is in concert with the social expectations and the social norms of my society, the academy in which I live and move and breathe? Am I fitting in just cozy clean? So the other way of putting that is live in such a way that if Jesus was not raised from the dead, then you really are an idiot. You really are a fool, to borrow from Paul, right? And that is, for me, that's one of the things that I try to ask myself, and I think that I try to provoke in students is, if this stuff matters, I mean, honestly, like, you can go do an MBA, you can go do a JD, right? Like, there's lots of other things you can do with your money and your time. Theological education is worth it if it's actually provoking us to live and enabling us to live in such a way that it's just possible people could imagine Jesus really was raised from the dead. That the Spirit actually lives in these strange people. That there's this alternative to the warring of one another, whether that's warring of genders now multiplied or of ethnicities and races. Like, is that just what we're stuck with? But if we're actually living in such a way that that people could at least imagine, like, oh my God, maybe that's possible. So somehow in how I teach, I hope that what I'm provoking is students asking the question of themselves constantly. I mean, this is kind of dangerous, right? But like, do we believe this crap? Like, why follow a God who's actually really, literally wants all of me? From my sexual life to my money, to where I live, to where my kids go to school. Honestly, a lot of days I don't. Or, you right, who calls me to forgive my enemies? So for me, that's the question. Are you living in such a way that you can't live this way if the gospel isn't true? If you could live this way and the gospel's true and you're like, hey, that's great.
That's great. Thank you, Aaron. All right, Wilmer, one last question for you, good sir. Although Cynthia Erickson's name has been invoked in this question, but not in vain, it's Pam King, our very good friend Pam King. And she's asking a question about boundaries, which I think is super interesting because sort of the model, Wilmer, that we have inherited is I stand behind a lectern, a student stands behind a desk, and there, among other dynamics involved, there are clear boundaries, right? I'm here and you're there. And at one level, it makes it safe. Mm-hmm. You're inviting us to either redraw the boundary lines or to transgress the boundary lines. But there's a possibility of sort of crossing a boundary or causing a boundary to become something that actually wounds because we're not talking the same boundary language, as it were. As Pam King asks it, how does Wilmer and also Cynthia address issues of boundaries that are appropriate to keep as faculty as also for students? There are many questions here, and choose whatever you want to answer. How do we share out of our depths while also keeping professional boundaries, however we want to construe those, right? Does clinical psychology offer insight or guidelines? Cue Cynthia. Should there be boundaries? So how about this? Wilmer, we need to come to the end of this session. Should there be boundaries of some sort, right, for us as we think about wanting to embrace a kind of vulnerability? But Pam King asks, should there be boundaries? If so, why or what?
Of course, there should be boundaries. And I believe those boundaries depends also who sets the boundaries. If there somebody up in the powers that be to set the boundaries, let's have a conversation. What boundaries are you afraid or want to preserve or conserve that are not allowing students and faculty? For instance, there's conversation about, in our own reflection on indispensability, about teaching that comes in both ways, and multi-directional learning, where professors learn from students and students learn from professors. So are we comfortable with that boundary, the new set of boundaries that, okay, I'm here to learn from you? Is that crossing the boundary? I think it's up to each faculty member to embrace a desire to cause students to learn by modeling humility. Humility in our learning, humility intellectually, humility in the way we approach students. For instance, if there are opportunities in which faculty, and I'm not against faculty administration of any kind, I think the boundaries are very sensitive to many of our students, particularly students of color, are very perceptive of how we set those boundaries. And because of who I am in this universe of academia and teaching, I'm approached very differently by students of color because they can see that I have to come to this place by working myself through all the expectations and the model that we know well. What is the model? I appreciate so much, Jeanette, that you share about your space when you come to classroom. Those are boundaries that are sometimes self-imposed because who I am that dictates for others to determine what's the boundary. I would say that Eric Mansour is professor of physics at Harvard University, and he was approached once when he was a junior faculty by one senior faculty saying, the way you're teaching is not going to get you far away in your scholarship. And what was he doing? He went out of his way to create environments where students were engaged in actual practice of physics. And students rate him high. He had the highest ratings. Now, his boundaries were completely out of control because he would hang out with students, he will have lunch with them, he will do experiments with them. But on the other side of the academia, we're saying, well, you're not going to get far away from by being the kind of professor you are now. But as of today, he's one of the experts of how to teach physics in a way the students engage. I mean, physics is, physics. And that, putting that in the context, those are the boundaries that a professor sets. But again, I'm for when we have our conversations at the faculty level, those are conversations that should be student-centered. Nothing is so much about faculty-centered. It should be student-centered. And those are boundaries we need to wrestle with, because I think at the end of the day, indispensability will come when we are centered on our students' learning and how we can assist them in that journey of transformation they want to do in their context, and that will be depending on how we can engage those set boundaries that we are probably need to have conversations over it. So since we love to have conversations about everything at Fuller, those will be things that we need to do. But I think it's already in place. It's already movement, because the multi-directional learning will reset those boundaries. But again, the politics of education again is faculty are here, students are here, and we have to live with that. But again, there is this bridge that needs to be created by practices and in our guilds, that one guild is not better than another guild. I think at the end of the day is if our students are learning and are going out into the world with better equipping and learning and a heart for the world as this, how to love neighbor better, we have done our jobs.
That is a really excellent word. I could end the conference on that word, Wilmer, but we have more to go, which is really exciting. So thank you, Wilmer, for your presentation, your thoughts, your comments.
Thank you.
We're very, very grateful to you. Dear friends, we have 2 hours for lunch, for a break, for a walk. We welcome you back in 2 hours' time. For those watching online, thank you again for being with us. We're so glad that you are here and present. And thank you for your questions. There'll be a unique Zoom link for today's afternoon session. So just look in your Eventbrite, emails that will come through. A link will appear, and you want to click on that for this afternoon. Otherwise, dear friends, thank you. Robert and Wilmer, thank you. You guys are awesome. Andy, welcome again, and we'll see you guys in 2 hours.
Hey, Andy King. Hey, Andy. Well done.
you.